Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, the Army's premier research repository containing both a research library and a significant archives dedicated to telling the Army story and preserving their history. Tonight, we're pleased to have Major General Mary K. Eder. General Eder served over 36 years in the Army, both active and reserve component service. She commanded at the company, battalion, brigade, and division level, and served as the Deputy Chief of the United States Army Reserves, Deputy Chief of the United States Army Public Affairs, and as Commanding General of the United States Army Reserve Joint and Special Troops Support Command. She retired from the Army in 2013. She has significant joint experience, including directing theater media relations during NATO's operations in Kosovo and at the inception of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. After military service, General Eder served as Director of Public Affairs at the George C. Marshall European Center for European Studies and served as a guest lecturer and adjunct professor at the George C. Marshall Center for Security Studies, the NATO School, and Sweden's International Security Command. Tonight, she is here to talk about her 2001 book, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, Untold Stories of Women Who Changed the Course of World War II. General Eder, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. And I will tell you first that I did much of my research at AHEC over the past several years, and I continue to do research there because I continue to learn more. Now, my book first came out in 2021, and my first engagement was at the Army Heritage Education and Research Center. So I've had a great time since then, and I continue to learn more about the people in my book. So as I talk about them, I want to add in just little bits more about what I've learned about them since then. Now, for those of you who may not know, the title of the book came from 2019 when the Emmy Awards presented the award for Best Supporting Actress to a woman who was in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Alex Borstein. And when she stood up, she said, in World War II, my grandmother was about to be shot into a pit. And she turned to a guard and said, well, what happens if I step out of line? And he said, I don't have the heart to shoot you, but somebody will. She stepped out of line. And for that, I am here today. And for that, my children are here today. So step out of line, ladies, step out of line. So that's where the title came from. But that was 2019, and I had been looking at many of these stories for a couple of years before that. And this is the first one I found, the story about Hilda Eisen. Now, I know it sounds kind of odd, but I had been reading obituaries as the members of the greatest generation continue to pass in larger numbers from this earth. The story of Hilda Eisen was captivating to me. That I read in the Wall Street Journal about how she had escaped from Nazi persecution, not once, not twice, but 3 times. She was 19 in 1939 when the Nazis invaded Poland, and she and her family lived near Lublin. She had just gotten married to her first husband, David, so they weren't with her family when they were rounded up and taken to the ghetto. It's a picture on the upper right of the ghetto in Lublin, where her family was. She and her husband stayed on the run for several weeks, and they stayed ahead of the patrols until they too were captured and ended up in that ghetto. One day she talked a guard into opening the gate. Oh, I need to go out, I need to do some shopping. And she and her husband escaped. They then spent the next 4 years in the forest fighting as partisans, fighting in the resistance, taking on the patrols whenever they could find them, getting supplies, making sure they didn't have fires at night. She said they would spread the coals on the ground and lay on top of branches over them. Personally, I'd be afraid I'd catch fire. But she said in her later years that I've never been cold again since that. Unfortunately, she was captured again one day out looking for firewood by a Gestapo patrol and taken to a local school, where she was taken upstairs in the second story of the school and told she was about to be interrogated. Left alone in a small room, she decided, I am not going to take this. This will not happen. And she jumped from the second-story window, broke a bone in her foot, and started to run. The guards outside fired over her head, around her, basically just letting her go. And she ran through the night back to the forest, where she was once again safe. But by the end of the war, her husband had been killed by the Polish people, and she returned to her small village to see what was left. And she said later, the only thing left of her entire family was a small piece of embroidery that had hung on the wall in the kitchen in her home. She was there just amazed at the devastation. And around her, there were then 4 other young people. Some had survived in the forest. Some had come from Auschwitz. They'd all found their way back to a home that didn't exist. And that's where she met Harry Eisen. And you see him here in this picture with her. Now, she'd known him since junior high, but they weren't friends then. But at that time, they decided they would go forward together. They managed to leave that area, walk, take a wagon, get a ride, and they ended up in Munich, where they spent the next 2 years in a displaced persons camp outside of Munich. I found that incredible in so many ways because we think about the end of the war and people go on. And for so many in Europe, that change didn't take place for 2 or maybe 3, 4, 5 years, trying to find a way to make a living, to get enough food, to start over again. And the only way they could start over again was through a cousin of hers who invited them to move to California after she wrote to him. They finally made that move. They end up in Orange County. They don't speak English. They have their first home. And that year, it was 1948 at Christmas time when there's a knock on the door. Now, you would think that given their past and all they'd been through, that this is not something you look forward to, something you're afraid because of a knock on the door. What could that mean? They didn't open the door. They stood in the shadows, looked out through the curtains, and waited till they saw people leave. And then they opened the door and discovered their neighbors had brought gifts for their new baby. And to me, that's the time when they began to really focus on, we can do something, we can make it, we can go forward. And so they decided to start their own business. They saved up their money, which wasn't much because the only job that Harry could get was in a hot dog factory, cleaning out the barrels because he didn't speak English. So after a while, when their English was a little better, they bought some chickens. And Harry began to sell eggs on the back of his bicycle. So by 2002, when they sold that business, their company, Norco Farms, was the largest egg producer west of the Mississippi. And I was fascinated with how they had made this happen, how they had created this life, how they had given back because they were both terrific philanthropists. I've spoken to their children, their grandchildren, and this picture of them in the lower right is at their grandson's bar mitzvah in 1996. There are stories of other people in my book who fought in the resistance, whether in Belgium or in the Netherlands. But I want to mention to you several of them who were very different. And this is Ida and Louise Cook. Ida and Louise lived in London. They were government employees. This is when they were younger, in the 1920s. They decided one day that they would like to go to an opera. So they saved their money. They didn't eat lunch. And they sewed their own clothes. And they finally went to an opera there in London. And they became groupies. They were total opera groupies. They're the ones who would hang out at the stage door and try to get autographs or try to tell the orchestra conductor what they thought about the performance. And after a while, they critiqued the leads in the operas themselves, but they became, over time, accepted into that community. So by 1935, when they're at an opera in Berlin Vienna, Munich. One of their friends, who was then the symphony conductor, said, listen, when you go back, would you take a friend of my family with you and just escort her? And they said, oh, sure, we'd be glad to bring her back to London. They didn't know that they were helping someone escape from the Nazis. And they did that over and over again for the next 4 years. It became dangerous. It became difficult. But one of the things that Ida said was, we did what we could do, and we didn't try to be anything else. And we had great faith in our passports that would save us. And it was that confidence they projected, I think, that got them through some of the more difficult trials they had in helping people, because they became famous. In some of these countries, people would line up to meet them and say, can you help us? But it was difficult to get people from Germany, Austria, Poland into the UK, because you had to be able to show you could be self-sufficient when you came into Britain. So what does that mean? If you have wealth, if you have any financial means in your family, you transform it into something that's portable. So Ida and Louise would travel to Vienna or Berlin in their simple clothes, their house dresses, their what they had bought from Woolworths, and their sweaters. And they would come back wearing jewels and furs and carrying purses that were laden with other items of jewelry, not paper money, but that which had been transformed into something more easily sellable. They had several encounters that were frightening on the train, where the Gestapo would question them. And one time in particular, Ida was wearing a giant brooch that was the biggest diamond anyone had ever seen. And it was so large that she thought it looked fake, so she wore it anyway. And they were able to escape and come back. Now, how did they fund all this? Because it wasn't easy for them to have the money to go to all of these events and bring back new friends. So they had spoken at churches. They tried to find sponsors for some of these people, but they also had another means of making money. This book you see here in the middle, A Harlequin Romance by Mary Burchell, published in 1947, sold for 75 cents then. But between 1935 and 1986, Ida wrote 112 romance novels. Later, she was the second president of the British Romance Novelist Association. And she would say that, well, in England, a romance novel is sold once every 3 minutes. So that was where some of their funding came from that let them become these saviors. Now, did they save the world? No. Did they save hundreds and thousands of people? No. But they saved 26 families from certain destruction. And this is at a time when people said, well, what can I do? I don't know what I could do. How can I help? And they found a way. Their assistance, their ability to make this happen ended in 1939, when Germany declared war on Britain, and they had to stop. But the people didn't forget them, and they were recognized later, but both by Great Britain, by Israel. They were featured in a number of television programs, and they wrote their own autobiography as well. Now, you would think in their autobiography, they would talk about their work during the war. The opera groupies, I have this book. It is 3/4 of it is what we thought of this opera and that opera. And the rest of it is, oh, and here's what we did in the war. They were very different. Now, I've read in some areas that there might be a movie made about them that talks about them as being spies, but I don't think so. I think they were exactly who and what they were. Middle-aged ladies, 2 sisters who just liked to go to the opera and helped out when and where they could, and they made a difference. Now, also in my book, I talk about people in the U.S. military and women who joined the military. There were 350,000 women in all branches of the military in World War II. But I want to tell you a little bit about Stephanie Rader. Hers was the second story I found. right after the story about Hilda Eisen. Because excuse me, Stephanie passed away in 2017 as well. And she's buried in Arlington along with her husband, Bill. Now, they didn't have any children. So to some extent, it was difficult for me to find more information about her and about him than I could just from the basics. Now, when she passed away, there was a big discussion about should she receive an award. She had never received an award for her military service, and the Legion of Merit was presented at her funeral. But what Stephanie did was something very unusual. She grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. Her parents were Polish immigrants near the area where Hilda Eisen grew up. And she didn't speak English until she started grade school. So she spoke Polish with a perfect accent, like a native. But in 1944, she joined the Women's Army Corps and was in that first class to be commissioned. Now, she was sent to Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and worked in basic training. And for any of you who have worked in basic training, you know it's repetitive. We do this, 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 and this with new trainees, and then every 6 to 8 weeks, we do it over again. And Stephanie was bored. One of her friends said, why don't you apply to join the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services? And so she did. And because of her language skills, she was accepted. Now, I didn't find out anything about how she met her husband, what she did after joining the OSS, up until the point when she served right in the waning days of the war and was sent to Poland. But her first assignment was to be sent to London. So in the beginning of 1945, that's where she found herself. And I'll tell you how I found out this part of her story. It was going to the Army Women's Memorial and seeing a video she made. I think it was in the mid-90s. It had never been transcribed. So on one day when it snowed, just like it is today in Pennsylvania, I got to sit in a back room with a video camera with a screen this big and watch her interview where she talked about her life, how she had moved into this job of being a counterintelligence agent with the OSS, and how she met her husband. Now, Bill Rader was a bomber pilot. He commanded the 303rd Bomber Group in England, one of about 350,000 Americans who were there with the Army Air Corps. He'd been shot down in the Pacific, and then as a reward given this command. And he met her on a blind date. Now, the odds were pretty good for her to be a young American woman in London, and there's all of these nice pilots to choose from. So she met him on a blind date after having rescheduled him for 3 or 4 times. And for years, he would tell people that he picked her up on the streets of London. So you can see that they got married just before she was sent to Poland. Now, in the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, there were a number of divisions. There was operations, which is the precursor to special operations forces. And Virginia Hall was one of those people. There's also a research piece that went to the State Department later, and cartography, the making of maps for intelligence purposes. But Stephanie was X2, one of the very few people to be a counterintelligence agent. And when she was sent to Poland, to Warsaw, in September of 1945, there was not much left of the downtown of Warsaw itself. There were very few buildings standing. In fact, General Eisenhower said it was the worst destruction he'd seen in Europe. She worked in the U.S. Embassy that was in this hotel where a number of other countries had their own embassies or consulates, because it was the only place with electricity and running water. There was nothing of her identity with her. She had a false identity as working as the secretary for the ambassador. What she did was travel the countryside and report troop movements, displaced persons, the presence of Nazis on the run, what was happening with the Russians, as they began to approach a time for the first free elections. And she did incredible work at a very dangerous time and was almost caught several times. She was finally outed, and that's when her time there had to end. But what she did made a huge difference in ways that we still don't know. So I am very, very much a fan of what Stephanie Rader did. And I think she made a huge difference in and of herself. And I've talked to her neighbors. Interestingly, since the book came out, I have met so many people who knew them. And at the World War II Museum in New Orleans last year, I met several people who had lived next door to her and helped her and her husband in their later years. She never talked about her time with the OSS. She never revealed anything. And it was not until the OSS files were declassified in 2008 and the OSS Society, kind of an alumni group, came and knocked on her door and said, "Are you Stephanie Check, and were you in the OSS?" And she said yes. And that was when her story first began to come out. So there's so much that we have that is still buried from those times because people were trained and told, do not ever talk about what you did. And they didn't. They never did. But I have to tell you about someone else who was also at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And you may have heard of this officer. This is later Lieutenant Colonel, but during World War II, when she served overseas, Major Charity Adams. Now, Charity grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. She too joined the Women's Army Corps, and in that same first class that Stephanie was. She too was bored with basic training after a while and kept asking for another challenge. And finally, she was given that challenge and told she would be deployed. She was given the orders and told not to open them until she was on the plane over water. So the first glimpse of water, which was probably the Chesapeake Bay, she opened up that envelope and took a look and discovered she was about to become the commander of the 688 Central Postal Battalion, located in Birmingham, England, back in the COMZ, providing support to forward troops. Now, what was the mission? Reduce the backlog of mail that had occurred over 2 years previously, the past 2 years. Because of the pace of operations, it meant the mail couldn't keep up. So there were 17 million pieces of mail that had not been sent forward at all. So you can imagine there's soldiers who haven't heard from their families, their parents, their wives, their children. They had no idea what's going on at home. They're worried, they're concerned. And the motto of this unit became, no mail, low morale. Now, Charity, while she was still at Fort Des Moines, did everything she could to prepare herself for that challenge. I've read her autobiography, and she talks quite a bit about the things she volunteered for. She did everything from travel with the WWII band to sell war bonds, to do reports of surveys so she could learn logistics. She wanted to make sure she could be a food service officer. She taught herself everything she needed to know for command. And the command she is given is a self-sustaining unit. So she had everything from a motor pool to a chaplain. And you know, you read about units that prepared to go forward in World War II, and that some of them trained together for up to 2 years. She met the people she had the day they arrived, and they arrived in 2 contingents. And they arrived in Scotland and then traveled south to Birmingham. She had just met the new commander for the COMZ, and he said, "So, Major Adams, can your troops march?" And she says in her book, "Well, I knew what to say to a general, and that was yes, sir." So we have more video of this unit than we do of many, which is a whole pass and review parade conducted there in Birmingham, England. And that's the picture you see her here on the left is the inspection she did before that. And they did wonderfully. So you can see some of that video on YouTube if you want to look for it. But then they had to get to work. So how do you resolve this backlog? And by the way, other units had been sent to do it and failed. So she divides her soldiers into 3 groups, 3 shifts. So they worked 24 hours a day, and each shift processed 56,000 pieces of mail. They were given 6 months to get this done. They did it in 3. And we all know what happens in the Army when you do well at a job, you get more to do. So then she and her unit were sent to Rouen, France, right after VE Day, where they cleared up a similar backlog of diplomatic mail. And then, as units began to disestablish and soldiers began to come home, it kind of came apart. And Charity was offered a new job at the Pentagon. And she said, I've been to the Pentagon. I didn't like it. I got lost. And she left active duty, went back to school, married her husband, a doctor, and they spent several years in Switzerland while each pursued advanced degrees before relocating to Dayton, Ohio. Now, how old do you think she was as a commander doing that job? She was 25. So many of them were so very young when they made these choices, when they took these risks, when they made the choice to, no, I won't take it. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to do this. And so years went by, and again, classified files, not releasable. Nobody knows the story. The unit had started to have reunions beginning in the 1980s. But it wasn't until 1996 when there was a Black History Month event at the I think it was the National Postal Museum, where she was invited there to speak along with President Clinton and said, well, it's certainly taken us a long time to be remembered, but they are certainly being remembered now. This picture in the lower right is of a monument erected to this unit at Fort Leavenworth in the Buffalo Soldiers area. And this is retired Master Sergeant Liz Helms, who is standing in front of it saying, we stand on their shoulders. Since then, the unit has also received a meritorious unit citation. And this past year, almost a year ago exactly, now, the vote took place to, excuse me, present them with the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, there have been only about 400 of these gold medals presented since. The first one was awarded to former President George Washington. So this one is still not minted. So the ceremony for that has not taken place. But certainly the 6 surviving veterans of this unit are well aware of what has been done for them, and certainly the families of all of the people who were in the 688 are well aware of this too. We will see more about them, I'm certain. There's going to be a Broadway play produced this year, and I understand there's also a movie that is in the works. So hopefully we'll see more of their story told. This is the only unit that is all female to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. So it's very significant. And finally, I want to mention just a little bit more about 2 people from the book. I don't have time to talk about them all, which I'm sure is probably a good thing in some ways, but I keep finding the connections between them, that some were in the same place, but at different times, or they knew the same people. Whether Stephanie Check and Charity Adams met or passed by each other while at Fort Des Moines, I don't know. But I have found connections between so many people in this book. One of them is Kate Flynn. Kate graduated from nursing school in 1944 in May and signed up, like half her class did, to join the Army Nurse Corps. Now, 56,000 American women served as nurses in World War II. They did not have it easy. If anyone thinks that nurses had an easy job of it during the war, they would be mistaken. Kate wanted to be a flight nurse. And so she ended up at what then was MacDill Fort McDill in Florida, but the program was full. So she was assigned to the 305th Hospital, heavy casualty, field hospital, heavy casualty. And after some training in England, her unit landed on Omaha Beach 2 weeks after D-Day. Kate is about my size, about 5'3", and she nearly went under in the waves, and the taller nurses had to pull her ashore, but she made it. And her entire unit made it from the beaches of Normandy all the way through until the end of the war and VE Day in Germany. She would wear her hat with 5 battle stars to Battle of the Bulge reunions. And she went through some really, really difficult times. There were times when she would talk about how they had to put up the tents. Now, a GP medium tent is not easy to put up, and I'm sure it's even more difficult for a group of nurses who were inexperienced, and they had to put up first the triage tent, followed by the surgical tent. And she would talk about when they were shelled, that they would roll the patients out onto the ground and lay on top of them. It was years until she went to a Battle of the Bulge reunion and met someone who said, "I remember you, you look exactly the same." She said, "I've waited years to meet someone who I treated then to know they made it." Now, Kate and her husband, James, had 7 children. So anytime I would want to know something more about her story, I would ask one of her children, who would then call a meeting of the others, and they would have to confer. "So how did your parents get together after the end of the war?" "I don't know. We'll have to check." And then they would come back to me and say, "Well, we're all very disappointed, but none of us know that story." Kate passed away in 2019. She too is buried at Arlington, along with her husband. Now, it was last year when her daughter, Marianne, called me and said, "I need you to talk to my neighbor," or my sister-in-law. I said, "Okay." So when I talked to her sister-in-law, she said, "I was so happy to have your book." Marianne gave me a copy of it, and I was reading some of the stories, and I thought, that sounds like Mary Taylor. So Mary Taylor, who you see in the center picture here, grew up in China. Her parents were missionaries, but when the Chinese had to realize what was happening with the Japanese, what happened with Mary and her brothers and sister, they were in a boarding school for Western children, and the school was overrun by the Japanese. She spent the years of her childhood between 9 and 12 in a concentration camp. Now you see her here in this picture. She's holding a piece of a parachute, because all of the children in that camp, and indeed the entire camp, was liberated in 1945 on August 19th by teams from the OSS out of a camp in China. So she survives the camp. She comes home. She grows up. She begins to have her career in New Jersey, in Haddonfield, New Jersey. She's a teacher. She's on the school board. And then she becomes the director of a juvenile detention center. Who better to understand children behind bars than someone who spent their childhood behind barbed wire? But what I learned from the sister-in-law is, oh, by the way, Mary Taylor was my neighbor growing up. And in 1973, she decided, well, let's have a barbecue. And she had the neighbors over. And actually, her neighbors called her the force of nature. And while they were there, she said, I think we need to have a 4th of July parade and celebrate this country. And so they sewed this flag, which you can see on the right. And for the next 50 years, it was carried in the 4th of July parade there. There wasn't any parade in 2020. And Mary Taylor Previty passed away in 2019 as well. But they put that flag up in front of her house, and people would come by just to touch it. Last year, the parade started again, and I think you can see in the background, there's a pretty ugly float that kind of looks like a plane. And in front of that plane are 6 of the neighbors who dressed up like paratroopers. And what they did was march along beside it while kids handed out flyers that explained what she had done, what she meant to the community, and what happened with her during the war. So I continue to find these stories. I continue to see the relationships, and I continue to be amazed by these incredible people. And I'm just happy to share their stories with you. So thank you so much for listening to me. And if you have questions for me about any of them or anything else, if I can tell you, I'm happy to do so. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, please use the question and answer icon at the bottom of the screen, submit them, and I'll pass them on over. I'll start with a pretty obvious question. Why is it important that these stories get told?
I think it's important for us to know as many of the stories of everyone who lived through those times that we can get to. Anthony Beevor, let me pronounce that correctly, the British historian, had said that we need to know all of the stories. It's not just about the politicians and the generals. It's about everyone who lived through those times, everyone who made a contribution. And some of these people made significant contributions that to some extent have been greatly forgotten. And if I can tell a few of those stories, it really is a privilege to be able to do so.
Lori wants you to tell more stories, though. She just came in with, it's not a question, it's a statement. She said she'd like to hear some more stories. But let me ask, is there one that you haven't highlighted in the book that somebody should look forward to?
Well, I think there's another one we're going to hear a lot more from, and that's Virginia Hall. Now, Virginia Hall is called a great spy. But if you look at the OSS chart of how their structure is set up, Virginia Hall wasn't a spy. She was an operator. She was a special forces operator. And that was how she saw herself. She was in France with the resistance. She trained the Maquis. She trained, supplied, led. And in fact, she was the only woman to receive in World War II, the only American woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions in combat against the enemy. That was something I didn't know before, and I was just amazed at what she had done. She escaped from Klaus Barbie by walking through the winter over the mountains into Spain.
Lloyd came back again. She says, please elaborate on the girl in the first story. Why is she here? I think that was the
that was Hilda.
Yes.
Because I think because of what Hilda did with incredible courage to escape 3 times, to not accept the fate that so many succumb to say, I will not give in. I will not stop. And she went to great lengths to make sure that she was able to survive, that she was able to go on, and that she was able to have a family, to have a legacy, and to keep the memories of her family alive.
This question is from Richard. What insights do you have about why these stories were not more widely known prior to your research?
I think to a great extent, some of these stories were not widely known because of the security concerns, and because so many files were classified, and because even at the time, people wanted to just go on, get on with their lives. Now, certainly, some of those people who, like Stephanie Check, decided that they would go on and they were not going to be able to do the same job again. Now, others like Virginia Hall ended up working for the CIA. The OSS was disbanded after the war, and it wasn't for another 2 years until the CIA came into existence. Some of that was politics, some of that was personalities. But certainly, I think that what they did was because of what they had been through before, and they found the times after the war to be very different. There's a term that I have learned about in the last year called liminality. And that means the time of the open door. This is the time after a great global change, whether it's a war, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, in which what was before is gone, but what is coming next is not yet here. That was, to me, the 2 years that Hilda and her husband spent in that relocation camp for displaced persons, trying to figure out what's next. So are we where we should be next? Or are we still waiting? Are we still trying? Are we still worried about being pulled back? And I think I saw that in many of these stories, and it was something I identified with.
Ed wants to know a little bit more about your grandmother.
Oh, my great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother, okay.
She was an immigrant from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, had a difficult life and adjustment in making her way with her husband, with her 7 children, and making it work. And just from what I know from family stories, I found great inspiration in the people who will not give up, who will not give in, and who will keep going no matter what.
Okay. Questions from Martin. How can we get these stories into the minds and hearts of our young women today? Are there any special outreach efforts?
Well, hopefully I get to talk to a lot of them, especially those who are interested in aviation. I've been able to talk to different groups about becoming aviators, especially talking about the WASP. The WASP stories, the Women Air Service pilots, those were lost as well until I think it was the mid-1970s when the Air Force said, oh, we're going to let women fly planes now. And the WASP veterans stood up and said, oh no, we were there. You need to remember us.
When you do tell these stories, do some of the young ladies today not believe that it was like that?
Well, I think that this as a history book may in some more serious circles not be taken seriously because of the style of it. Because I tell these stories in a way that I want to appeal to young people who don't know that history, or who may think of World War II as being back there with the pyramids, too far away. And in so many ways, for our world now, it's just yesterday. So it's not, look at all the things we're doing now that are new. Look at all of this ground that's being broken. They did it first.
But their stories weren't told, so that's the challenge.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have formally. What else would you like to discuss? Any closing thoughts?
I think to continue to look at how some of these stories continue to be told, because what I'm finding now as I read articles about nurses in World War II, those are downplayed. Or, well, the WASP pilots only flew planes that were being ferried from factories to bases, or they pulled targets. They didn't fight in combat. They did in Great Britain. They did not in the US. But if you consider what these people accomplished, given the restrictions, the culture, and the norms of the time, it is incredibly significant. And the big takeaway is because of what they did. It was in 1948 that President Truman, on the 12th of June, decided to make women a permanent part of the armed forces, because up until that point, it was for the emergency only. So when the war ended, everybody went home. And then 2 months later, he desegregated the armed forces. So it was because of the performance of women and minorities that the whole future trajectory of the armed forces changed.
You came in just to try, if I guess, about 1977.
Yes.
Did you come in as a WAC or did you come in the regular Army?
I came in as a WAC. I was in the last class and I had no idea what that meant.
Okay. What was that transition like?
At the time, I recall it being a very big deal to everyone else, but I wasn't quite sure what that meant to me. I was well aware I was going to be a military police officer. when what I wanted to do was public affairs, but I didn't know how to get there. So it took me a while to figure that out.
Oh, Lori, would like a little bit more about your career. What do you consider some of your great assignments?
I think my greatest assignment was in Europe. I worked for the Army for a while as a civilian. I was a public affairs officer at then Fort Lee, Virginia, and I am thrilled to see it being renamed this year. And I took a job with the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany, working in education for the former Soviet republics. So I taught the role of a free press in a democracy, in addition to doing public affairs for the center. And I did my reserve time at UCOM. So I had a crash course in everything about World War II in the European theater, living there. And I was just enthralled with all of it. So I think that's where my, one might call it, obsession with all of these stories started.
Well, if you get back up this way, I want to introduce you to Dorothy Bakora's collection. She was a nurse, just like one of the individuals you highlighted, but she was one of the first to go into 2 of the death camps and act as a nurse. Some of the death camps, and she has a number of oral histories that she did. So I'd like to introduce you to her when you come back.
Kate Flynn was at one of the death camps as well, and
Okay.
she never talked about it afterwards. But one of the things I found in doing research at AHEC was that the Army Heritage and Education Center has all of the papers belonging to Wild Bill Donovan, the commander of the OSS. 31 boxes worth, which are not yet digitized. And I was privileged to be able to go through one of them the last time I was there doing research on the Russian Liberation Army. But I'm fascinated with the incredible depth and reach of what AHEC has to offer. And I knew those papers were there only because one of my sources was the former historian for the CIA, and she told me they were there.
Yes, we're slowly digitizing them, I believe. It's almost, I think there's almost 300 linear feet of materials on Wild Bill Donovan. And I no longer have a security clearance, so I can't wander into that part of the collection. But it is, I think, a treasure that folks should hopefully someday gain access to. I also say that climate people should look at it because quite often he had area studies that provide a 1940-ish baseline with hard numbers that sometimes, we go back and predict what it was back, but he actually has hard data. What's your next big effort?
My next book comes out this summer. It's one of my friends after this book came out said, "Hey, you ought to write about my grandmother. She was a cop in New York City in 1915. And I said, really? So between 1915 and 1918, she was a volunteer because there were no police women or police officers. They were matrons who cleaned the jail cells. And so the volunteers were on the streets wearing uniforms, and basically they were taking care of runaway girls, looking out for them during World War I, because the training ships and the Navy were in New York. So they had to protect the girls from the boys and the boys from the girls. And after that, she became a sworn officer in 1923. So the book is about her and her cohort. She did everything from swing a nightclub in Prohibition, to work the masher squads, to serve as serial bait for a serial killer, to infiltrate undercover the Nazi movement in the 1930s in New York. So it's every major event, I think, for the first half of the 20th century in New York told from that perspective.
And this book comes out sometime this summer?
They won't tell me when, but sometime this summer.
Okay. Where can we find a book about the girls?
The girls are at Amazon and anywhere else. I think they're at Barnes and Noble and other stores that sell books. And they're also at the Army War College bookstore and gift shop.
Someone says you said there are lots of them at airports, correct?
They are being sold at airports. Hudson Booksellers has them in airports.
Okay. Anything else in closing?
Thank you for the opportunity to let me talk about them. I feel like I know them now, so I like to share their stories and let people get to know them a little bit too.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come tonight. It's been a pleasure to host you. Those who are in attendance, please let your friends know that this lecture will be posted online within the next couple days, and they can come and hear it again, and also then pass it on to others that may have an interest in what was discussed tonight. I'd ask you to come back in about 2 weeks on 8 February at 7 p.m. We're going to move up into the 21st century. We're going to look at the 173rd Military Police Company in Iraq and their efforts training the Iraqi police. A much different story than what we had today, and one that shows some of the challenges we had during the past conflict. And our guest will be Master Sergeant Retired Mark Youngkist. So please come and join us in 2 weeks. Again, General Eder, thank you very much for joining us today. And please, when it's not snowy, come on up again and let Ruth and I'll join with you. Okay?
Sounds great to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good night.